In 1616, a book called The Hermetic Romance, or The Chemical Wedding, allegorized the act of incorporation as the mysterious bonding between a royal bride and groom, referred to in the story as the sponsus and sponsa. Notice that sponsus and sponsa derive from the Latin spondere, meaning to bind oneself. The last word is important. It's not just the act of binding, but of binding oneself, pledging or promising yourself. And though rare, the root of spond does show up in some Latin-based vocabulary. Ankylosing spondylitis, for example, describes a medical condition in which the spine can fuse. The root spond is a linguistic ancestor of the word bond, as the grapheme blend of sp has morphed over time into the B sound. And this is why, in law, the term respond can mean to rebond yourself. As such, state nationals and sovereigns often avoid responding to government presentments, many of which are legal attempts to rebind parties of a previous contractual agreement. A bond binds, and the state of being bound can involve chemical links, legal obligations, and even the state of romance. The Spanish word for bride, esposa, is almost identical to the Spanish word for handcuffs. Sitting conspicuously in the word romance is the root word Roman, pointing to the Roman Catholic Church combining individual souls as pieces of the universal body of the Church. The word Catholic means universal in the sense of all-encompassing or all-enjoining. From the corporate perspective, individuals, a term originally meaning indivisible, were now seen as simply parts in a greater individual, the church body. In the Hermetic Romance, a wedding of chemical elements transmutes the sponsus and sponsa into one corporate body, similar to the idea that married couples are defined in Matthew 19:6 as one flesh. This Bible verse goes on to warn us that what therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder, or what God has incorporated, let no man separate. This biblical warning points to the fact that the Church values incorporation very highly. Similar in many ways to the Hermetic Romance is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein. The story's antagonist, Victor Frankenstein's monster, is an accurate metaphor depicting the act of chemical incorporation being used to embody, to create a corporate body. The protagonist, Victor Frankenstein himself, represents the counterweight to the corporate body dead entity in the form of a natural, living man. The two play out a dualistic struggle, both in the natural world of physical reality and the jurisdictional world of legal fiction. Mary Shelley doesn't describe the method of the monster's embodiment or animation in her novel, but it's assumed to involve piecing together dead body parts, then sparking the conglomerate body to life with a lightning bolt's electromagnetic pulse. And lightning works well as a catalyst for the Hermetic Romance, especially as romantic bonds are often described as the attraction between two lovers experiencing magnetism and/or electricity. Another novel, published almost 30 years earlier by Nogueray, uses a similar character name, Vaucanson Frankenstein. And in the 1730s, a real person named Jacques de Vaucanson actually was building automatons or androids using hundreds of metal parts. His rusted gear automatons were hat-tipped in the film The Best Offer with Geoffrey Rush. We don't know if Shelley read Nogueray's book, but it is an interesting overlap involving the concept of animating the conglomerate or dead corporate entity. Shelley's novel opens and closes on shifting blocks of ice in the Arctic Sea. Robert Walton, the story's narrator, is sailing his hired ship on an expedition to the North Pole. The sailors get stuck in the ice, and while they wait for their ship to break free, they spot a giant man driving a dog sled in the same northerly direction. Walton mistakenly assumes the dog sled is traversing on land, and this mistake is key to the story's subtle act of disclosure. About 2 o'clock, the mist cleared away, and we beheld, stretched out in every direction, vast and irregular plains of ice, which seemed to have no end. Some of my comrades groaned, and my own mind began to grow watchful with anxious thoughts, when a strange sight suddenly attracted our attention. We perceived a low carriage, fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs, pass on towards the north, at the distance of 1/2 mile. A being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. We watched the rapid progress of the traveler with our telescopes until he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice. This appearance excited our unqualified wonder. We were, as we believed, many hundred miles from any land, but this apparition seemed to denote that it was not in reality so distant as we had supposed. The dog sled is moving on plains of ice that form a false land, in stark contradiction to the true land of rock and dirt the dog sled had recently traversed. And the true land's comparison with the false doesn't occur until the end of the novel, when we catch back up with this Arctic scene at the story's beginning. I continued with unabated fervor to traverse immense deserts until the ocean appeared at a distance and formed the utmost boundary of the horizon. Covered with ice, it was only to be distinguished from land by its superior wildness and ruggedness. I pressed on, and in 2 days arrived at a wretched hamlet on the seashore. I inquired of the inhabitants concerning the fiend, and gained accurate information. A gigantic monster, they said, had arrived the night before. He had carried off their store of winter food, and placing it in a sledge, had pursued his journey across the sea in a direction that led to no land. I exchanged my land sledge for one fashioned for the inequalities of the frozen ocean, and purchasing a plentiful stock of provisions, I departed from land. Moving from land to sea is a change in legal jurisdiction, as discussed in my previous video on Admiralty law. What's more, this change in jurisdiction from land to sea is being made by a corporate person and a natural man. And that's central to the novel's underlying and largely hidden point regarding property rights. That Shelley describes this jurisdiction as full of inequalities tells us something about how the author views the jurisdiction of Admiralty. As the novel nears its end, the monster has been leading his creator, Victor Frankenstein, on a chase through Eastern Europe. Victor is determined to kill his hideous creation, and the monster is exacting a hateful revenge of his own, leading Victor into the mysterious region of Tartaria. Victor gives a brief account of the route of the chase. Guided by a slight clue, I followed the windings of the Rhone, but vainly. The blue Mediterranean appeared, and by a strange chance I saw the fiend enter by night and hide himself in a vessel bound for the Black Sea. Amidst the wilds of Tartary and Russia, although he still evaded me, I have ever followed in his track. Various historical maps place Tartary somewhere between China and Russia. Peter Heylin stated in his 1633 Microcosmos that Tartaria was originally known as Scythia. and Mercator's 1595 map showed the pink region of Tartaria, including Nagai Tartary and Kasaki Tartary, extending west all the way to the Black Sea. In 1580, John Frampton deep-dived Tartaria for England's Muscovy Company, an offshoot of the Company of Merchant Adventurers that was formally incorporated in 1555, and was a precursor to the similar British East India Company. The Muscovy Company was originally headquartered in Moscow, but in 1717 the company moved operations to Archangel, a harbor town Walton mentions several times in the novel. In fact, Walton indirectly mentions the company located there in a letter home to his sister. I shall certainly find no friend on the wide ocean, nor even here in Archangel, among merchants and seamen. Such merchant adventurers would sail to various locales looking for trade routes, and their travels are pertinent with regard to Shelley's novel. In fact, Victor Frankenstein and his monster seem to be reenacting the travels of the merchant adventurers of the mid-1500s. Frampton's book for the Muscovy Company provided motivation in the search for this northern trading route, describing the trading potential of Tartaria, Scythia, and Cathay, also known as Cataya, as the reason to continue their search. But in his description of Tartarian customs, Frampton noted an odd burial ritual. After this, the friends of the deceased take an other horse and kill him, and eat his flesh, and fill the skin full of hay, and sewing it together, raise him up with 4 pieces of timber upon the sepulchre, in token that there is one buried. The Scythians had a somewhat similar ritual. There are many of them that sew the skins of men together as though they were skins of beasts. But why would Frampton bother to report back on such gruesome customs in a study on the region's trading potential? The answer may lie in the similarity between these rituals and the metaphor of the corporate straw man, alluded to as the Tartarians filled the skin of dead horses full of hay. These customs, these monstrous customs of the Tartarians and Scythians that Frampton recorded in this corporate trade manual, may have informed early notions on how to utilize a straw man as a tokenization of the natural human being as a legal stand-in. The modern theory of the legal straw man is attributed to Roger Elvick, a theory that describes a token corporate entity, a legal fiction, to which every natural living human being is legally attached. The quick search of the Justia database brings up 1,500 legal cases addressing the use of the straw man to temporarily hold land in trust. The straw man might also be described as a legal monster, a term Black's Law Dictionary defines as someone which cannot be heir to any land. But though a monster can't permanently inherit, the legal straw man device may act as temporary trustees. Mary Shelley never names the creature in her story, and since 1818, when the novel was first published, readers have conflated Frankenstein with his monster, to the point that the monster is often referred to as Frankenstein. And that's entirely in keeping with the fact that a living natural person's name is also given to the created straw man, though the second version of the name is usually in all capital letters. In his book on Tartaria and Scythia, John Frampton makes an especially intriguing and relevant statement regarding corporate law, writing that the Tartars were without any laws or policy. The term policy originated in law French, the language that was used by the Normans to express their legal system in England after the invasion of 1066. Obviously, policy in Frampton's book refers to something separate from law, a distinction we still make today to separate the rule set used to govern territories like nations and the rule set used to govern corporations. Sir Edward Coke touched on this distinction in his commentary upon Littleton of 1628. Bodies politic, etc. This is a body to take in succession, framed by policy, and thereupon it is called here by Littleton a body politic, and it is also called a corporation or a body incorporate. Professor Theodore Lowy also explained the distinction in a 2003 article for the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy, writing that public policy is an established concept only in the English language. In the United States, the idea of public policy is relatively recent. Law was the word in the American founding. Public policy did not enter the picture at all until well into the 19th century and far from law or legislation. And the Tartar's lack of policy would hold a specific meaning to the members of the Muscovy Company. It would indicate that there were no competing corporations operating in Tartaria. According to Professor Glyn Holton, cities were the first entities the Romans treated as corporations. The Latin word for city is polis, and I find the typesetting of Frampton's term policy noteworthy, as it places a colon between the root pol for city and the second half of the word ici, French for here. Frampton's term policy could be an early portmanteau, meaning city here, or the city present. The idea that the city is wherever its citizens happen to be. Such a concept would be invaluable to the early corporations of adventurers exploring the far reaches of the world for trade routes. A legal concept regarding the city here could refer to an adventurer's legal ability to bring his home city's legal protections with him into new lands. Understood this way, corporate policy would provide the ultimate circumvention of jurisdiction, allowing for trade without customs, which is exactly what the 1567 trade agreement between the Muscovy Company and Russia promised. And Sir William Gerard and his company desired of us that we would grant them license, and the trade to be without custom, which request we have granted. Corporate policy, then, not only governed its members, but protected them as well. And this may go far in explaining why governments today are in the habit of corporate protections, corporate subsidies, corporate loan guarantees, and corporate tax loopholes. Even the concept of corporate regulations, so named in hopes of convincing the public that the government is always reining the corporation in, are only implemented to protect the embedded corporations from newcomer competition. The bottom line here, the reality staring us in the face that we rarely, if ever, see, is the lack of a boundary between corporations and government. And while it may seem that governments create corporate entities through charter, it's actually the other way around. Ancient corporations created modern governments. David Sipley of the University of Denver explains, the U.S. Constitution is best understood not as a social contract, but as a popularly issued corporate charter. The earliest American colonies were literal corporations of the Crown and, like all corporations, were ruled by limited governments established by their charters. From this, Americans derived their understanding of what a constitution is, the written charter of a sovereign that ordains and limits a government. The key Federalist innovation was to substitute the people for the king as the chartering sovereign. This effectively transferred the governance technology of the corporation to the civil government. And let's repeat that so its importance isn't lost. The governance technology of the corporation has been transferred to civil government. And this goes back to feudal times. As Wikipedia tells us, Parliament evolved from the great council of bishops and peers that advised the English monarch. Such an act of advising might be more accurately described as the parley of Parliament, less an act of advice than of negotiation. Those peers advising the king, those peers who evolved into Parliament, were the merchant adventurers operating as corporate trade monopolies. And the bishops advising the king were the representatives of the controlling church that first introduced corporate protections in the first place. So Parliament, and later Congress, evolved from the body of corporate executives and church bishops, pushing the importance of incorporation. Corporations were valued highly by the church. They were also valued highly by monopolistic merchants and traders. Government was simply an afterthought, and the Dutch East India Company is a good example. As Wikipedia again informs us, the VOC Charter allowed it to act as a quasi-sovereign state. As such, it's not surprising to see Mary Shelley portraying the government syndicate in her novel Frankenstein. Victor's father, Alphonse Frankenstein, is the mayor of Geneva, and the Genovese title for mayor is syndic. Today, a syndicate is defined pejoratively as a business cartel or a monopoly. Governments were born from the monopolistic syndicates and corporations chartered by medieval monarchs, because their corporate agents were advising the monarchs, and it's from this group of corporate advisors that modern governments evolved. In Shelley's novel, the syndicate is shown to be the precursor, the literal grandfather of the monster. Alphonse Frankenstein, the syndic, was Victor's father, and Victor describes his father's work early in the novel. I am, by birth, a Genovese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors and syndics, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public business. Another way to understand public business is that of government business, carried out via incorporated monopolies or syndicates. Victor Frankenstein explicitly says in the novel that a knowledge of anatomy isn't enough to animate a dead body. For that, you need an education in the field of Victor's father, and there's nothing spiritual or superstitious about it. It's the realm of the syndicate. Unless I had been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to this study would have been irksome and almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. It turns out the chemical wedding of incorporation isn't magical or supernatural or even mysterious. It's legal. And in Chapter 19 of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley linguistically connects the ability to animate a dead corporate body to an act of parliament in the mid-1600s, a time she calls the most animating epoch of English history. Regarding the most animating epoch of English history, Victor Frankenstein sets the stage, telling Walton, From thence we proceeded to Oxford. As we entered this city, our minds were filled with the remembrance of the events that had been transacted there more than a century and a half before. It was here that Charles I had collected his forces. This city had remained faithful to him after the whole nation had forsaken his cause to join the standard of Parliament and liberty. For a moment my soul was elevated from its debasing and miserable fears to contemplate the divine ideas of liberty and self-sacrifice, of which these sites were the monuments and the remembrancers. Shelley's repetition of remembrance alludes to its corporate meaning, the act of reincorporation following the dismembering of the corpus into body parts. The act of remembrance, then, is the act of remembering that body. The term remembrance speaks to the function of a membrane, that which both connects and separates or demarcates body parts. Cell membranes individuate the cells of the body, creating barriers that define and demarcate those cells. As a barrier, membranes are selective, allowing some things through while disallowing the inclusion of others. Membranes also hold body parts together, such as the body's fascia, which is described as membranous layers of tissue. In this context, membranes determine and hold together body membership. The act of remembrance, then, is similar to the legal term resolution or re-solution, the reincorporation into chemical solution. It's the act of reconstituting the corporate body of various members. This understanding casts a very different light on the rhyme of the 1605 gunpowder plot. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, implying that others should return to the plot's cause and remember, repopulate, and reincorporate the plot's mechanics. It's important to realize that the gunpowder plot wasn't an attack on the corporate body of Parliament, as suggested in the movie V for Vendetta. The intended victim of the gunpowder plot was King James, while he was in the Parliament building, making the movie scene that finally successfully culminates the plot a historically deceptive piece of propaganda. It was never a plot against government corruption. Its explosives were the tools of pro-corporate Catholics against the king in order to secure Parliament's corporate power. We can also see the term remembrance used in several papal bulls that refer to the ongoing or perpetual succession of land. The Romanus Pontifex, the papal bull of 1455, uses the phrase perpetual remembrance twice, as the perpetual corporate ownership of lands in Africa given as favors by the Pope to King Alphonse of Portugal, a possible inspiration for Shelley's use of the name Alphonse Frankenstein as the Genovese syndic. The succession of land as perpetual remembrance is the corporate ability to hold land in perpetuity, something the medieval church enjoyed under the doctrine of mortmain, which is another law French term meaning dead hand. This meant that once land fell into the hands of the church that never died, that land would never again be relinquished through the process of probate. And the concept of member as body part, especially one phallic-shaped, can apply similarly to the phallic-shaped fingers as parts of the hand. In contrast to the dead hand of the church was the dead entity of the corporate monster, legally prevented from inheriting property through perpetual remembrance. Both devices were creepy, and that's because they were both dead. But they wouldn't stay dead for long because the corporate organizations of the church and the merchant nobles and peers combined forces via Parliament to animate the dead entity. The victory of Parliament over Charles I that Victor Frankenstein remembers while in Oxford allowed for a change in English law 17 years later that would animate the corporate body, the Tartarian strawman or monster. This legal change was a new piece of English legislation known as the Second Sestakay V, enacted by Parliament in 1666. The term Sestakay V is another bit of law French that means he who lives.
It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
The Sestakay V Act of 1666 was one of several legal devices involving the pronoun phrase he who. This phrase expresses various iterations of a trust beneficiary. In the case of the Sestakay V, he who is qualified as he who lives. But in the legal trust known as Sestakay use, the pronoun describes he who has use. In the case of he who lives, this Act of Parliament allowed the government to not only endow legal personhood, but to decide which corporate persons were legally alive and which were legally dead. These Sestakay trusts are almost always described, even today, as being enacted under a specific monarch, implying that it was the monarch who benefited from the trust legislation. For example, here, a Sestakay V trust is described as first created during the reign of Henry VIII of England through the Sestakay V Act of 1540, and updated by Charles II through the Sestakay V Act of 1666, wherein an estate may be effected for the benefit of one or more persons presumed lost or abandoned at sea and therefore presumed dead. But this description is misleading. Trusts of Sestakay and mortmain have historically been the vehicles of Parliament, not monarchs. These trusts were invoked to work around the monarchy's demands, and monarchs implemented opposing statutes, negating various aspects of those trusts, like the 1290 Statute of Mortmain and the 1536 Statute of Uses. These statutes were meant to invalidate the corporate ability of these trust vehicles to avoid tax, wardships, and feudal obligations. A common situation might involve passing land through a Sestakay trust to someone other than the owner's primary heir, in order to protect that heir from these legal obligations of land succession. And this is probably why monsters were legally prohibited from inheriting property. It was simply another back-and-forth move in the struggle over land between the monarchy and Parliament. The text of the Sestakay V of 1666 also introduces a specific jurisdiction allowing the government to legally determine life and death, that of admiralty. Recital that Sestakay Vs have gone beyond sea, the modern translation being, noting that those who live have moved beyond the jurisdictional boundary of the territorial sea into the high seas. But the point here is not whether he who lives is alive or dead. The point of the legislation is to demarcate the boundary within which life and death can be legally defined. In Shelley's novel, moving onto the ice of the Arctic Ocean is a move into admiralty jurisdiction and reflects the monster's move out of the territory of Russia and into the sea-based realm in which his status as a dead entity, a straw man, or monster can now be legally changed to that of he who lives. This allowed the merchant adventurers, the ones sailing beyond sea in search of trade routes for the benefit of the state corporation, to be protected by the various corporate trusts that Parliament enacted for them. This isn't at all surprising, as Parliament was comprised of these corporate merchants and bishops of the corporate church. And so the Sesta KV of 1666 animated that straw man, bringing to life the dead Tartarian horse stuffed with hay that tokenized the dead and buried natural man. But why would Mary Shelley be interested in Sesta K trusts, or motivated to write an allegory about them? The answer is that Shelley was particularly interested in the rights of women as they pertain to property law. In A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had written, "Hereditary property perverts the mind." As such, her daughter, Mary Shelley, was interested in the inheritance of property, especially as it pertained to women. For example, the Sesta KV Act of 1540 gave the rents due a deceased wife to her husband, with no mention of rents due a deceased husband being given to the wife. And yet women were able to engage in land use as instruments of the trust protecting the owners of that land. That this corporate trust monster must finally die was clearly Shelley's point in Frankenstein, a truth even the monster himself understood. "Fear not that I shall be the instrument of future mischief. My work is nearly complete. Neither yours nor any man's death is needed to consummate the series of my being and accomplish that which must be done, but it requires my own. I shall quit your vessel on the ice raft which brought me thither, and shall seek the most northern extremity of the globe. I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame. I shall die. He is dead who called me into being, and when I shall be no more, the very remembrance of us both will speedily vanish. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea." Shelley seems to be suggesting that the way to kill the monster is to return the corporate device to the sea, the jurisdiction from which it sprang. The monster had already returned Frankenstein's original papers detailing the creation of the corporate body. Now it was his mission to destroy the corporate body itself, the same mission Victor Frankenstein had also adopted, as he recounted to Walton at the end of the story. "I had determined, if you were going southwards, still to trust myself to the mercy of the seas, rather than abandon my purpose. The monster is eloquent and persuasive, and once his words had even power over my heart, but trust him not." So ends Mary Shelley's novel about the corporate trusts governing land that were based on the jurisdictional powers of the sea. But the fact that the monster, in the middle of the novel, had demanded a bride, left the story open-ended for later writers and filmmakers to expand on it. And the modern metaphor of the Bride of Frankenstein that would come later seems fitting. Two incorporated monsters further joined in the ancient ritual of a chemical wedding, a hermetic romance. I'm grateful for any feedback. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.